Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Two Mates and a Mate. Ryan Hassan. I've been waiting a couple of months to say that, Daniel.
Yeah.
Ryan Hassan from the Center for Healing here, joined by fellow co-creator of Embodied Processing, Matt Nettleton, and Daniel Maté, best-selling author, co-author with his father, Gabor, of The Myth of Normal, which is now, you were just telling us, been on the bestseller list every week, bar one, since we spoke last.
Yeah, 8 out of 9 weeks since it's been released.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Yeah, on the New York Times bestseller list, not, no less. I don't know how it's doing in Australia, but I'm told that in England it's doing uncommonly well for a serious book. The Brits apparently are very silly in their book. This is what the British publisher tells us, that like it's just like fluff, celebrity, monarchy stuff. That's what people tend to read in hardcover. When the book comes out in paperback, they think that it'll sell like hotcakes, but that compared to most hardcover nonfiction, we are doing very well, relatively speaking, in England. So
yeah, it's funny you say that. We did was it last week, Matt, or a week before? We did a talk for a group in the UK, and I think I might have made reference on something, and I sort of said, "Oh, who's read Myth of Normal?" And most hands went up, and I'm like, "Oh, great, we're on the same page here."
Good.
So
Good.
That's reflective. We thought we'd jump on here and touch on a topic. Obviously, last time that we spoke, we went in depth around the book, but also, a lot of your history and your past. And we have gotten such great feedback from that. And we thought we would jump into a specific topic this time when we chatted. And we thought the adult, child, and parent dynamic would be a great one. You touched on that last time that we spoke, and you're saying that maybe the next book may have some of those themes flowing through it. So we thought we might speak with you about maybe what are some of the ideas that are going to come up for that next book around those dynamics? Because I know for us, we have a lot of students or clients that we've worked with, and they have this situation where they're doing this work on their self, they're processing a lot of stuff from this past, and now their relationship can become even more strained, with their parents, especially if they're not kind of on the same page of healing and doing the work.
Even if they are, believe me.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, look, it's not just going to be running through the book. It's going to be the topic of the book. The next book, whenever we get around to writing it, will be called Hello Again, a fresh start for parents and their adult children, or adult children and their parents. I can't remember which. And that one's going to be Gabor and Daniel Maté, or Daniel and Gabor Maté, not Gabor with Daniel. So I get to step up into the full-on 50-50 chair. Yeah, it's cool. Because this one's personal for me. Myth of Normal was my dad's work, but this one is really going to be a lot about what I know from experience, plus what I've learned working with a lot of different people. So yeah, it is a very interesting topic. First of all, I think it's we've been doing this workshop since 2016. I'm flying to Vancouver a week today to lead another one. We just did one in New York State last month. It was great. And they're really popular, and people seem to get a lot out of them, and it's time to write a book about it. It's a very tricky topic for a lot of reasons. It's very, very virgin snow territory. Like, there's not a lot of people who have explored it in depth. If you go to any bookstore and you go to the parenting section, how many shelves of books are you going to find about how to parent your kid from preconception to college drop-off? And these days, there's books about how to kick your deadbeat 35-year-old kids out of your basement. And then as far as adult parents goes, or parents to adult children, there's books about how to say goodbye to your dying parents, how to deal with dementia, how to grieve your dead parents. And maybe there's some books about how to heal from your narcissistic asshole parents. But what about just a book that navigates the territory of these decades, often, that we have together as grown-ups? I think it's taken for granted that things are probably as good as they're going to get between you. You're both fully cooked. That's the unspoken assumption. And that's just as well, in a sense, because it's an optional relationship to work on. If you're married, you chose to be married, and if you want to stay married, you better work on it. If you're a parent, you got some obligations in there, and you want to, really, what is there to accomplish with your adult child and the parent? coexistence. Okay, well, that doesn't take much, unless you're living in the same house. But even then, you live separate lives. You do not need each other the way one of you needed the other before. And then we start to peel another layer of the onion and see that it's just a very unique relationship. I mean, not only did you not go and get into it by choice exactly, one of you wasn't even around to make choices when the choice was made. You were drafted into this particular time and place with this particular family or lack of one. And these particular people. And you sort of look like them. So there's this expectation that you're, and ideally it would have felt very natural and home-like. And for some people it does, but for some people, it's not a perfect fit for all kinds of reasons. As far as the parents go, yeah, they chose to have a kid. They didn't choose to have this kid. And there's no return policy. And there's no customer service line you can call. So it's optional and it's fraught. When you met, one of you was an undifferentiated blob of protoplasm, basically. Just neurons firing, tons of brain development going on, but no coherent sense of self or of the world, just sense perception, not even continent. And the other one was a fully grown adult in most cases, or at least a almost developed adult, with total responsibility for the other. That's how the relationship starts every time. And then somehow, over the course of 2 decades, you're supposed to somehow get to the point where you can coexist in the world as equals, or something like equals, whatever arrangement you have. It's the most past-based relationship you can possibly imagine. On top of that, you may be both on the healing journey, but the parent is recovering from their childhood. The adult child is recovering from their parent. Like, literally, my dad's nervous system is the nervous system that conditioned my nervous system and taught it what life is, and what my mom's too, and taught it what the world is and what life is, and around, it's not that they caused it, but they were the starring roles in that scene, in that whole scenario where I became who I am. So now my nervous system has a memory of theirs. My dad's voice is the same. My mom's voice is the same. That can change when there's a catastrophe or a sudden decline. But for many of us, we're still dealing with, they look the same to us, even if they've aged physically. So I'm trying to keep my ground. I'm trying to hold my own in my life without being too reminded of my parents. Now I'm trying to actually be close to them and not have my childhood trauma dominate things. And meanwhile, they're dealing with all the intensities of being a parent, which I have to admit, I don't have experience with because I don't have any kids. But clearly it's a powerful, visceral thing. And it seems that you never lose that sense of a physical, felt sense of, that connection with that child. So it can be very painful when children pull away, and parents deal with it in different ways. So all that to say, it's a very rich topic. It's a strangely niche topic, like no one really talks about it, but it's totally ubiquitous. And it's optional, and it has a lot of challenges to it. The question is, what are the rewards? Is it worth it? And each person has to answer that for themselves. But if you entered into the territory, you might want to have a map, and that's what we're trying to provide.
Yeah, it really is a dynamic like no other, even hearing you describe it there.
Yeah.
And, it was real funny, actually, as you're talking at the start there, I had a conversation with my 3-year-old son literally yesterday. We were all in the car, and just out of the blue, he goes, "Daddy, so who's your mummy?" I'm like, "Well, that's Nan, and why don't you live with Nan?" And I said, "Well, I live with you guys." He goes, "Why?" And I said, "Well, when we grow up and we become, autonomous, we can look after ourselves. Then we go out and we start to explore the world ourselves." And you could see him go, "Yeah." And then he started then reflecting like, am I going to have to leave mummy kind of thing? And he's like going, oh, no, no, no. And I'm like, all right, we'll stay together for now. Maybe a bit early to have that conversation with him. But I think of all the different relationships, people have with their parents. I remember one of my uncles would see his parents, my grandparents, every day, and he was in his 40s, 50s, 60s, every day for lunch. He'd go there. Other people I know haven't spoken to their parents for a decade. Other people do the obligatory, I'll speak to them on the phone once a month and visit them once a year for Christmas. And there's just so many different dynamics in place. And one thing that I maybe like your experience on doing these workshops is you spoke about, so as the adult child in that relationship has been through all of their existence and all the childhood stuff comes into that. Do you find that children tend to not acknowledge the parents' childhood as much because they weren't around then?
Yeah, it can be a blind spot. And we have a section in the workshop where you start to just do some wondering about what the other person might be carrying.
Yeah.
And that can help. But, some kids are all too aware of what their parents went through.
Yeah. Well, you are, because your dad wrote about it so much.
Yeah. I mean, the Holocaust it was talked about in my family, so I was, but that didn't really help me because I had nothing to do with that.
Mm.
And again, I didn't choose to be born into this thing. And I have to admit, there have been times when, and this is not a fair thing to think or say, but nonetheless, part of me has sometimes said, well, okay, fine. But just because I didn't live through the Holocaust doesn't mean I wasn't terrorized. But I don't get to have my thing. My thing was a small T trauma. He's got the big T trauma. In fact, I had big T traumas too. But like there's, when a parent's childhood the narrative looms over, it can become a burden. It can become an obligation. It can become something people resent. So, yeah, it can be extra challenging for certain kinds of adult children. I am one of them who tend toward the aggrieved prototype, where we stay in the position of having been done wrong and never wanting to let the parents off the hook.
It's interesting, sorry, finish what you were going to say. Okay.
No, that's fine.
Like when our parents go through, like intense periods of time and traumas, like say the Holocaust, like their nervous system is still vibrating with that frequency. They're still carrying, unless they've done a lot of work, they're still carrying that with them. And, like, especially in the first 3 years of life, mainly with the mother, but also with the father, it's like our nervous system and their nervous system are one. So we're taking on all of that. So we could actually say you went through the Holocaust, but on a frequency level, on the level of the felt sense, because you feel everything your dad's feeling, you feel everything your mother's feeling, especially the mother. You put a baby in the other side of the house, and if the mother's got anxiety, the baby will be feeling that anxiety. Their nervous systems are symbiotic. They're one in a kind of dual unity. And we then carry that. And a lot of the time, I don't know if you know much about sort of object relations theory and like the individuation process. And a lot of the time we never separate from them. We never individuate. We never become our own individuated separate being, and our nervous systems can remain entangled all through adulthood. And so we can be in a relationship with our parents where we're age 2 on a nervous system level. Cognitively, we feel separate from them, but on a nervous system level, we can still be age 2 connected totally to them and their trauma, and their past and what they experienced before we were born even. And then we're living out those dynamics as adults. And this is why, some people, it's like, they go to Christmas and it'll end up in a big fight. It's because they're reliving that childhood nervous system communication.
Well, I mean, who are you telling? This is this you're describing me and my parents. Now I should say that's me. My siblings each have a different relationship with my parents. I won't speak for them. But I said to my dad when I was 9, I don't know where I end and you begin.
Yeah, there you go.
Or where you end and I begin, that more like it. So, I mean, that confusion, that lack of individuation, So it's interesting to get a feel for what it starts to feel like when you do individuate a bit. And working so closely with my dad really teaches me experientially what it feels like when I am and when I'm not, how the world feels, how the world tastes, the texture of it, the way it looks, the thoughts I think, the feelings in my body. And I've had times during our workshops, including even recently, where I've had to leave the room because I was just too triggered. And I was transparent about it. I said in front of the room, you know, the responsible thing for me to do is to go outside and clear this out. And we had a terrible incident. This is just before I first talked to you guys. We had an event here in New York where we were it was a book launch really for a Hungarian nonprofit organization. And they were so excited to have my dad, and they invited our whole family over for a Hungarian meal beforehand, and home cooked, you know, chicken paprikash and noodles and cucumber salad. It was very, very lovely. And then there's this event, and they asked me if I would moderate. And I said yes. And so here's my dad. He's the guest. He's the guest of honor. And I'm moderating. Now, 4 days previous in Vancouver, we'd had the book launch in our hometown. And we too were the special guests. And we had a third moderator who interviewed us and took the questions from the audience. And now I'm stepping into that role. But it was very unclear to me, and I only realized this when I got up on stage, what it means to be the moderator when there's only one guest. And essentially I realized, fuck, I'm the interviewer or something. Well, at least I better ask some interesting questions. So I got tense. I had tried to ask my dad beforehand, just if we could talk it out. And he was just very like, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. I felt something in my nervous system. I wasn't quite at ease. So I was starting to like, okay, how am I going to make this interesting for myself? How am I going to ask interesting questions? Because this whole audience has heard my dad answer the same questions over and over again. He's been answering them 6 times a day for the last 3 weeks on the book tour, on the press tour. So I came up with some like what I thought were spicy questions. But when I asked them, they were kind of landing wrong. And I could feel that they were landing wrong, either with the room or with him. Like some people were with me and my sense of humor was coming out, but it had a bit of an edge to it. And I just noticed his body language going into places that I know what that body language means. He's angling away from me. He's not really riffing. He's not riffing with me. He's not enjoying my way of putting it. He keeps redirecting things back to his comfortable place. Now, the intelligent, individuated adult me would be like, well, this is how this event's going. Cool. Let me ask him a few more questions. We'll throw it over the audience. We'll be done. Doesn't matter. I prefer the other event, but whatever. But that's not what happened. I just kept pressing and pressing. And he kept getting more and more. He started standing up and turning his back to me and gesticulating to the audience. And when he gets loud and impassioned, all of a sudden my little nervous system can't tell, or even my big nervous system can't tell the difference between that and his raised voice when I was a kid. And his raised voice when I was a kid was bad news. And now I feel like I can't reach him no matter what I do. And now I have the story, he's disrespecting me and he's dismissing me. And so I make some kind of joke to try and lighten the mood because I'm also worried about the audience. I'm in this position where my role is I'm supposed to be moderating. Now I'm moderating. I'm like running interference between their beloved homecoming hero, the Hungarian Gabor, and this audience. And I don't know if I'm the good guy or the bad guy. And at a certain point, he says, "Are you upset, Daniel?" Like I said some joke and he said, "Are you upset?" And I got so angry and put on the spot because that's always been his way of deflecting. Like I think I said something about, hey, like, let's lighten it up. And he said, "Are you upset?" And I was like, now in my head, I'm like, I'm being gaslit. Anyway, you get the point. Even as I tell the story, I could start to cycle into it. But it was, and at one point he said, "I'm done with this, Daniel. You're really bugging me now." And like in front of everybody. Now, of course, just before I'd gotten there, I'd been watching a podcast interview with him, with Dr. Chatterjee in the UK, where he told the story of when he hit me across the face when I was 3. because I wouldn't sing happy birthday to him in front of the family. And he smacked me across the face in front of everybody. And I had posted on Instagram, oh, it's so nice to have a father who admits this in public. And yes, it happened, but we've worked it through. And then I get on stage, and literally that is the experience I'm having. Of course, he didn't hit me, but I froze.
Emotionally,
and then
that's what it felt like, right?
And I started to dissociate. And I just was like, okay, questions from the audience. And then afterwards, I go up to my mom and sister and are like, can you believe that shit? And they're just kind of like cringing, because to them and to my brother, who was watching over live stream Zoom, I was the aggressor. I was the instigator. And they're not partial to like letting my dad off the hook when he behaves. But I think they were feeling protective of him because he was so tired, and it is his event. And they didn't quite see, why couldn't I just relax and let it happen? But what I had to, and they may still not understand, you know. Now I can accept that I didn't react optimally. And my dad and I have worked it out between us. Like, we've talked about it. And I've given up my story that he was disrespecting me, that this and that. But I also have to acknowledge that it was just a bad setup for where my nervous system was at. Like, that was structural. And if I actually could go back and do anything differently, it wouldn't be handling it better on stage. It would be saying no in the first place, because it was a demotion for me. That's how I saw it. I'm his co-author, damn it. I know the answers to these questions. But I somehow put myself in this position where now I'm competing with him while pretending to be loving and supportive and collaborative. And he's resisting me. And it was almost complete. It felt like it had been set up like a practical joke. It was that uncanny. So yeah, the nervous systems can get locked in. And what he said later, and he said this at our parent-child workshop last month, is that what he didn't see in that moment was my pain. That's his side of the dynamic. You know, I couldn't see his goodness and his fatigue and his vulnerability and his humanness. And he couldn't see my pain underneath the provocation. And if he could have, he would have responded very differently. So I think that pertains to what you asked and said, that there's an example of two people who have every reason to like get along, be proud. It should have been a night to celebrate. And our old nervous system dynamic whirlwind just swept us up, and it ruined the night for me, and it put a damper on it for him. Now, of course, part of the fucking idiocy of the whole thing, or the part of the risk, the threat, or the pitfalls, is that for a lot of people, oh, that's so cool to watch. Look, they're being so authentic. I wish my father and I, it's so human. Oh, I relate to that. Some people were uncomfortable, but many people come up to me, they're like, I totally relate, or you're great, or, you know, your dad's a really good person. And people like, so as a performance, it's content that people will take in. It's just not the content I want to replicate anymore. And I said to my dad, we're not doing that anymore, Dad. Whatever it takes, we're not doing that. I'd rather not do it in private, but we're certainly not going to do it in public anymore. So we had to put our intention on something new and just make sure that whatever we do, that's not an option. Yeah, and it takes that degree of intention to change any habit in this very habituated relationship. It takes that degree of fuck no to the past and fuck yeah to what we actually want, if we can identify what that is. And sorry for all the cursing, but
no, it's good. We do it all the time. Yeah, it's like,
see this cup, good vibes only.
Yeah, like I can relate, you know, with my parents. It's like so much, and then my relationship to them has transformed, like unrecognizable, you know, compared to what it was. But it's like my relationship with them through most of my adult life was exactly like that, reenactments. just reenacting over and over and over again, the same arguments, the same feelings, the same, traumas. It's just the same thing coming up over and over and over and over and over again. And so our relationship was a loop. That's all it was. It was just, it would go around in circles and in circles, and in specific situations, it would trigger specific loops. And so we weren't even in relationship to each other. We were in relationship to each other 20 years ago, when they were created, and now we're just reliving them. So we're not actually having any present moment connection in that experience. It's just a pattern, that plays.
Absolutely. And, if we were in the workshop, I would reframe that slightly for you and for everyone in the room, just to give us a little bit more purchase, a little bit more traction in terms of the ability to shift it. It's not even that you're in a relationship with them 20 years ago. You're in a relationship with your story about them 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Even 20 years ago, you didn't know them. You experienced them through an interpretive filter, which was not chosen by you. It was the best option you had. And it certainly seemed that way to you, but it was in many ways. And we sort of stumbled upon a really crucial distinction the last time we did this workshop. Your observations about them may be accurate, right? Like if your mother's an alcoholic, then it's accurate to say she's an alcoholic. And if you call her a raging alcoholic, well, if she goes into rages, then she's a raging alcoholic. But just because you're accurate doesn't mean you're right. Right is a way of being. It's a certainty and an insistence and a doubling down on a particular narrative with a particular set of significances and conclusions and therefores. And that's why. And that is a whole narrative structure that's explanatory, interpretive. And that is not what's happening. That's not the facts. Facts are in the domain of accuracy. Rightness is in the domain of position.
Yeah.
And we come from these positions with each other, and they leave us unable to see who's there, except the parts that confirm and vindicate the story we are wedded to.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of the work.
Yeah, there's no other dynamic that things can get adversarial so quickly. And it's because it's not just that story from 20 years ago, but it's every story that we've told throughout our life. And there's so much conditioning. And, we can be at a dinner and our mum or dad will say something in a certain tone, and anybody else on the planet could say that same thing in the same tone, and we would not worry at all. But for us, it's like, oh, they're doing it again. And then that dance, you're talking about with you and dad, the dance starts where we're trying to get one up on each other. And that, like you said, pulls us further away from connecting.
Yeah. I mean, at least when two boxers get into the ring together, they pause for a minute, they bump gloves, and they let a referee tell them the rules, and then they go about it.
And they hug afterwards, right?
Well, yeah, ideally, or with wrestling, at least it's fake. You're talking about the dance. One of my favorite expressions that I made up, I think, is it takes two to tango, but it takes one not to. And I think Esther Perel actually said something very similar, just not quite as colorfully, it turns out. But that, and this is why another principle of our workshop is that relationships are not 50-50, or at least they're not 50-50 if you want them to work. If you want to be miserable and stuck in habits, then have your relationship be 50-50. If you want to have a relationship that's satisfying and exciting and generative and ever shifting in good ways, have it be 100-100. Or better yet, just have it be 100. Because the other person's 100 is none of your business. Yeah, and that is hard to let go of. Well, I'll do it if they do it. No, it doesn't work that way.
What if one person's 100 and the other person is, 10 or something, and that plays out for a period of years? Is there a place then for setting boundaries or that kind of thing? Because I find a lot of people get frustrated at that.
Yeah, of course there is, but we come back to the first principle I said. It's optional. So you don't have to be in a relationship with this person, which means you're choosing to be in a relationship with them, which means you're choosing to be in a relationship with them.
Brilliant.
as they are.
No obligation that I have
There's
to.
no obligation whatsoever, which means that it's got nothing to do with their 10. That's the 100 they're giving. To gauge what they're giving, they may have lower capacity than you, which means 100% means less. It's just none of your business. Just don't even worry about that. The thing is, given what they're giving me, given what I'm receiving, and my capacity to handle it and process it and metabolize it, how much of it is too much for me? How much of it is too heartbreaking or too upsetting or too triggering? What distance do I need? What conditions do I need? Under what conditions am I able to stay true to my 100% intention? Under what conditions does my intention get subverted by those nervous system habits? How can I insist on the conditions that I need? I'm responsible, not for everything that happens. I'm responsible for my experience. And that doesn't mean to gaslight yourself and say, oh, they never did anything to me. They might have done things to you. My dad has done things that I consider betrayals or transgressions in my adult life. And those are very important moments to me. And I won't forget them. But I don't get to hold them against him. They're just information. Right. And so they don't justify any position or stance on my part. I could say my trust hasn't been restored yet. I don't fully trust, so I'm going to act like someone who doesn't fully trust. That's fine.
Great. I'm glad you
just
clarified that.
got a question around, like your healing journey. You said at the start, you can feel the difference between when you're individuated, so say for example, when you're on stage with your dad, it's kind of like we lose that sense of individuation and we merge, our patterns merge and become one kind of dance that plays out. How do you know, in your experience, the difference between feeling individuated? Because you talked about boundaries, and what I find with boundaries is a lot of people are able to learn to set boundaries, kind of intellectual boundaries, but they still don't feel boundaries.
Exactly. 100%.
So how can you tell the difference in your daily life when you're relating to your dad, whether you're in that space of individuated from him, like you're in Daniel's authenticity rather than just reenacting childhood patterns?
Yeah, well, I think there's two ways. One is I'm fully connected to my authentic passions and pursuits, and my personality is flowing freely. And I'm not laying it on too thick, and I'm not hiding it. When I'm on stage with him and I feel, and he has something to do with this, because when he gets concerned about me, it does affect me, just like any collaboration. If we were teammates on a team sport, the way he plays the game is going to affect how I can play the game. That's true. But when I feel, when I'm at the piano or I'm in the musical theater audition room or doing the things that I do that have nothing to do with him, I feel very much myself. When I'm working with him and we're both being complementary, he's doing his thing, I'm doing mine, we're riffing off each other, I'm like, oh, okay, it takes two separate people to do this. Now we're one, but in a much more conscious way. The way, Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen seemed to have one mind, but they didn't. They were separate, and that's what made them unstoppable, because you can't stop them both. You know what I'm saying? Like they just knew, so that's high performance in collaboration. And the other thing is when sometimes I'll surprise myself, or my dad will surprise me. I'll just be sitting there and I'll look over and be like, oh, look, there's my dad. And when I can say that, like, oh, look, there's my dad. It sounds very simple and maybe even trite, but the ability to say that means that here I am, I'm located over here. And he's over there, and he's doing whatever he's doing. He's just doing his thing. And here are my thoughts about it, my opinions and my habits and my impulses. But my nervous system isn't being tossed around it's not caught up in the storm of reactions to what he's doing. He's just over there doing what he's doing. So that's the thing that's that zone, that balance on the boogie board that that is worth practicing, because you want to get a sense for what that feels like so that you can experientially recreate it. Because I mean, boundaries to me is one of the most overused words in the zeitgeist. It's just another word. It sounds like another word for, like, I don't know. People mean it well, and I'm sure it has very strong value for people. Clearly, boundaries are important. But I prefer to think of conditions. What are the conditions under which I thrive? What are the conditions under which I can't thrive? What do I need? What am I unwilling to tolerate? What am I going to insist on? What am I going to be flexible about? Boundaries has a very rigid definition. If you think of a border, it's drawn on a map, but even then, border policy changes from time to time depending on what's going on inside the country. So sometimes we can be more permeable. Sometimes we have to be a little bit more protective of our boundaries.
But I like that. What are my conditions to thrive? It has a bit of a nicer feeling, because boundary has that connotation of like, well, here's me and there's them. So it's quite
right,
separated.
but the implicit assumption in boundaries is that if I put up a boundary, then over here I will be healthy and thriving and able to whatever. So let's focus on that rather than this, because then I'm always watching the fence. Now I'm always patrolling the boundary, and that's not thriving. Now I'm in this like oppositional stance, and people can get an identity hit from being like, oh, you're not going to play me anymore. Like I'm keeping my boundary, but that's a defensive posture. There's no real growth in it, as opposed to like, okay, whoa, the conditions aren't right if you come any closer.
Well, it's kind of trendy as well to, announce on social media that you divorced your parents and you're, not speaking to them anymore. And then everyone gets behind you and goes, yes, good on you. And it is very adversarial. Yep. Yeah. The energy behind
it. Feel it. It's pseudo self-assertion.
We can use boundaries as it's like it comes out as a trauma response, like you said, like patrolling the fence. That's a response to trauma. It's a sense of hypervigilance and protectiveness.
Yes.
True boundaries, feeling boundaried, it gives a sense of individuation, but it doesn't lose connection. It doesn't cut off someone. You don't close your heart. And, like when I know when I'm with my parents and I feel individuated, there's a sense of power in my belly. It's like I feel like my own separate sense of I, and I feel like I'm completely individuated, almost like I'm a mountain, standing there like a presence, there's a presence to it. And I know when I fall into a pattern with them, the belly, that sense of presence, that sense of empowerment that's in the belly that holds, it's like the glue that holds that sense of individuation together, that falls into a collapse. And there's like a helplessness there. Yeah. And I'll feel out of control. And it's like instantly my whole being it's like fragments, it loses that unifying glue. And so, the boundaries, like just setting boundaries and like, like I'm cutting my parents off or I'm setting a boundary with you, it doesn't have that unifying, empowering, felt sense of being an individual,
I think that's right. And because it's rigid, and being a true individual is not getting locked into rigid identity things. And a boundary has a kind of permanence to it, and boundaries need to shift. Now, look, better to have imperfect boundaries, too rigid boundaries, than to have none, I would say. At least at first. Some people need the scaffolding. If they've spent their entire lives having their dignity infringed upon, maybe their bodily space or even their body violated. Well, whatever it takes, man, like set those boundaries. But, I had a recent, when you're talking, it's Matt, right?
Yeah, Matt. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a recent experience with my mother, and it was the same week actually as that incident with my dad. She was here in New York, and she had been kind of nursing some hurt feelings about something I had said at the Vancouver event. Just one little comment I made on stage to someone's question. I talked about how I can be physically allergic to my parents sometimes. And the truth was that I had ended up in the hospital on that trip for some real stress related, like My guts were literally twisted. Like it was, but it wasn't my parents' fault exactly, but they definitely, staying with them was the trigger. It was a big trigger. But the ground was set, before that, before I even came back to Vancouver. But anyway, she took exception to that, and she wanted to let me know, but she didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to have a conversation. She just wanted to let me know. And like, that doesn't fly with me. Like, if you're going to give me feedback, like, let's talk about it.
Two-way street.
Well, that's, I might have things to say about it. I mean, I could just take it, but then now all I know is that you were upset. Would you like to know where I was coming from? I'd like to come to an understanding. So we talked about it for a while, and it didn't really go anywhere. So we dropped it, and we went for a walk in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. And we got to this patch of grass, and it was a beautiful, warm September day, blue sky, kind of one of the last days of summer. And beautiful fluffy clouds floating by very low overhead. And she goes and lies down in the grass. She says, Daniel, come down and lying down in the grass. It's so beautiful. And my whole nervous system is like, nope. I don't want to go near her. I don't want to lie down in the grass with my mom. Ew. Like, that's what it was. And there was also all this judgmental stuff. I'm like, you're so goofy. Like, why can't you be cool? And of course, another voice in my head is like saying, shut up, jerk. Like, it's a 75-year-old woman who wants to lie in the grass. How wonderful. Like, lighten up. But then I'm like, no, I won't lighten up. So all this, now I'm into this like civil war about like whether I should lie down in the grass with my mom. And I finally said, well, this is an invitation. Do I have anything to lose? No. Maybe it might be nice to lie down in the grass. If she wasn't here, I would. So I did. And I lay down in the grass with my mom, and it actually calmed my nervous system a bit. And my nervous system remembered, oh yeah, there were times when my mom and I really vibed when I was a kid. That it's a fractious relationship and fractured and fraught for that reason, because I associate connection with her with losing connection with her. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that as an adult, I can't curate experiences where we just connect for a bit, and then we'll get up and we'll keep walking. Like, nothing's at stake. So we just lay in the grass. And from there, we sat up and we had a really productive conversation about what happened in Vancouver. Once we were back on each other's wavelength, once we were seeing each other not as a threat, once, and I was able to say to her, Mom, I totally hear you. I can see how it came off that way. I really don't want to be slagging you guys in front of people or exposing you. That's not really my intention. I know it comes off that way. I do have an edge to me sometimes, and I imagine it's very hurtful. And I said, I've asked you in the past, do you give me carte blanche to share whatever I share in front of groups? And you said, yes. I said, if you want to revoke that at any time, just let me know and we'll change the rules. But until then, I need you to know that I'm trying to do something very difficult here. This is a very difficult unicycle I'm trying to balance on. On the one hand, there's honoring you guys, loving you, being mature, being a good example of, healthy individuation, and also just being loyal to the family, like not being a brat, showing you love and respect that you deserve. On the other hand, what I'm doing with Dad in this work, and also as a creative artist, is predicated on fully being myself and letting my negativity have its voice and finding my way. And so as I'm learning to, I'm doing all this in public, I'm not complaining. It's a privilege to get to do it. And I happen to be the kind of person who gets a kick out of that, but it doesn't mean it's easy work. It's work. And I said, if I tip too far to one side or the other sometimes, I hope you'll cut me some slack and just give me some grace and know that I don't mean to do it. And just let me know if that was, but don't take it so damn personally if you can avoid it. And she really got it. She said she got that it wasn't personal and that her guilt got triggered, and that was her taking responsibility for what she was bringing to it, which is a whole set of other stories that's hers to tell. So that was an example of nervous system co-regulation being something that my nervous system that my mind wanted to protect me from, that some part of me clearly craved, some part of me was cynical about, some part of me was really hurt. That like, yeah, right. you know, remembering severance between us. And there's reasons for that in my infancy, which weren't even about parenting. They were just about my, you know, the birth itself and my development in the first few months. But then I overrode that by saying, okay, well, something's available here. I want to try it, see how it goes. I'm safe. I can regulate myself lying on the grass next to my mother. I don't need to lie right next to her. I did. And we both were grounded, and we both lay on the same ground, had common ground, quite literally. I didn't see that before. That's good. I love language. And from there, in that grounded place, we were able to sit up and talk to each other like adults in the present moment.
Yeah, but there's so many invitations and opportunities in this, you know, adult, child, and parent dynamic for us to lean in to more co-regulation and attunement. And it takes a level of awareness that you had in that moment to take it's that we all have it, that childish part. It's like, no, I'm not going to go over there. And it's like, we have to be able to override that part. One of the two parties, if not both, has to be able to override that part. And I guess your mum kind of did by inviting you over there, right? It's like we lay the weapons down for a moment and say, hey, lay your weapons down and come over here. And then when
then I invited her to have a different kind of conversation than the one we were used to having. And we're both, and that was playing to both of our strengths, because my mom is playful and I'm, at least in our relationship, she's the playful one and I'm the methodical one. In my relationship with my dad, I'm the playful one.
Yeah.
So we each got to be ourselves. We each got to bring a different kind of, and you're right. And the word invitation is very important. And here's the deal with an invitation. If it carries a consequence for declining, it's not an invitation.
Yeah.
Like your mother doesn't invite you to come home for Christmas. That's not an invitation.
It's a demand.
Yeah.
Well, basically,
it's an expectation, you know.
Expectation, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. All right, we're coming up at the top of the hour, so I want to be respectful of your time, Daniel, but I think that's a really wonderful point to actually finish on, because I think when people are approaching this topic, they're trying to have discussions or resolve something from this stance, you know, instead of where if we can regulate first. And you made me think back on my life, and some of the most open and vulnerable and great discussions that I've had with my father is not where we're coming together to talk about something, but we've been, you know, out fishing or maybe playing golf or doing something difficult, working, building something. And then after a couple of hours, we're both like, and then we can start really openly talking about something. So that attunement and co-regulation is always the first step. Otherwise, that dance is going to start that we don't want to start, and we're going to end up with maybe more issues than we started with.
Yeah, that's very important. And I'll just also offer, in terms of, you know, wordplay, that I think can be helpful. Talk about resolving issues. Some people want to solve problems. I consider myself not a problem solver, but a problem dissolver. I think we do ourselves. I think we act with more intelligence when we try to dissolve the problem before we try to solve it, because often it's not the answers that we're lacking. It's that we're asking the wrong questions. We're asking questions that are pre-programmed in a script that's founded on impossibility, that's founded on familiarity, that's always proving itself correct, or right, I should say, you know? So being willing to consider that not only what the hell song is that from? Not only do I not know the answers, I don't even know what the question is. Some like heavy metal song.
Good line.
What's that?
It's a good line.
Yeah. I'll have to look it up. So yeah.
We can't solve the problem from within the problem. It's like if we're in a defensive posture and we're trying to solve the defensive posture from the standpoint of the defensive posture, we're perpetuating the defensive posture, you know. And so dissolving the problem is to step completely out of the problem, you know,
or at least to soften the edges of it a bit.
Yeah. And, you know, like we do that by metabolizing, by stepping into the felt sense and digesting the childhood patterns that was there, you know, and then we can actually step into a regulated place and lay down on the grass and have a constructive conversation.
I would say that too, but I, you know, given that I'm the mental chiropractor, that's my designation that I gave myself or someone gave me, and not the somatic therapist, I have tons of respect for the body and the nervous system, obviously implicit in the stories I just told. It was running the show. It was a big thing. But I want to put in a plug for the power of clear, aligned thinking.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the nervous system will follow the mind's lead. I actually think that it's not always the nervous system that leads. I think sometimes if we can develop the habit for, okay, what's my actual intention? Now, sometimes our nervous systems are so dysregulated that we can't even remember that. Fair enough. We got to have, but if I know what my intention is, if we've created an intent, like my dad and I created the intention of good vibes for our last retreat. And that became so important to me that anytime something started happening, I had a place to go to. Even when the nervous system started acting up, I was like, okay, where are the good vibes? Where did the good vibes go? Oh, I see. That thing I said, that was bad vibes. So now we're, okay, cool. And then my nervous system calmed down.
Yeah, we would call that a resource, in our work. We create a resource.
That's right. So then the mind, exactly. Then the mind becomes a faithful servant.
Yeah.
Rather than this tyrannical autocrat.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love what you're saying about problem dissolving, because so many people walk around. We have these stories and narratives. Most people think that everybody should like them. No one should dislike them. They should be happy all the time. Their parents should never make them upset or angry. And that's a problem, but you can never solve that problem. That's an impossible one to solve. And many people spend their lifetime trying to solve that problem, but it's kind of like chasing a rainbow and you're never going to get there. So if you can actually deal with that narrative and story, it is more of a dissolving process for a problem that cannot inherently be solved. So
yeah, only thing is that when you dissolve it, you're going to have to deal with whatever was frozen inside. Like whenever you thought there's something frozen inside that was unpleasant to begin with and that you never wanted to feel again. So that's the problem you were trying to solve. The original problem, which is no longer the problem, but it feels that way because you're still encased in the protective coating of whatever that habit is. So you might have some pain to feel. You might have some grief to feel that it never will have been any other way than the way it was. Yeah. The futility that I can't make everyone like me. I can never be good enough to deserve love. Even if, it's like I had this experience recently. I had a heartbreak earlier this year. I've had a lot of breakups and they've all been difficult in various ways, but this one was it just lacerated my heart. And I still feel it when I think about this person, but it just couldn't be, at least not at that time. Couldn't be. And I've come to realize that there's this tragic, romantic fantasy that I have about overcoming impossibility in a relationship and someday just winning somebody over from the other side. And that has been my idea of what exciting love is. And that's where all the euphoria comes from. Those little moments where it seems like it's going to happen. And that's where the desperate heartbreak comes from. So my whole life, the women I've fallen for are just not there for me, including the woman I married. And this most recent person was just clearly dealing with her own stuff. She told me from the beginning. And I was talking to someone and they were like, yeah, you might need to go do some healing on that and realize it's not about these individual people. It's about some inner need you had. And I said, I don't want it to be about some inner need I have. I want it to be about them. Like I'm going to have to grieve even the sad, lonely, desperate, tragic thing that I'm going to have to grieve that my suffering is obsolete. Like there's no point to my suffering, like that it's futile, that the whole thing isn't true. Poof, it's, the bubble is burst. Part of me doesn't want to give that up. It's so lovely and sweet. And part of me doesn't believe that there's anything else out there. So if I give up that, what will I have? Who will I be? I'm still dealing with that. I'm still dealing with that.
In the book, you guys talk about Almus a fair bit, and he talks about holes.
Yes.
It's like what's there in the absence of that structure, that emptiness, that deficiency, that lack, and that's sort of what we have to face and come across.
Well, he would say that there's essence there.
Yeah. Well, through that deficiency, that lack is essence, that space, that hole. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I'll have to take his word for it sometimes because yeah, until I get there. As Joni Mitchell said, people will tell you where they've gone, they'll tell you where to go, but until you get there yourself, you'll never really know.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. Daniel, we really appreciate you. We appreciate all that you've been able to speak about today. We appreciate, obviously the book, but everything else that you've done, and also everything that you're going to do. And we're really looking forward to, once you get done with all the interviews everywhere and all that kind of thing, that obviously the beginning of writing this new book. So thank you so much for joining us again.
My pleasure, mates.
Two Mates
Thanks
and a Mate, episode 2.
I think this has legs.
I think it does. It does. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Any comments, anything that jumped out at you from this talk, just put it down below. And we appreciate you all, and we'll speak to you next time.